On today's show, the regular season schedule is here for the Cavs. Let's break down the easy parts, the tough parts, and yet again, a brutal month of March. That's all straight ahead on today's Locked On Cavs.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find the show wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, anywhere else. Be sure to drop us a 5-star review. Help us grow the show here at Locked On Cavs. Also, make sure you check us out on YouTube. Just search Locked On Cavs on YouTube. If you're watching this video right now, hit that thumbs up button for me. Make sure you click subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when the latest Locked On Cavs content is going up. Today's show, of course, is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Hi again, everybody. I'm Danny Cunningham. You might know me for my time covering the Cleveland Cavaliers at places like 92.3 The Fan, Cleveland Magazine, and a number of other stops along the way. And today, really going to dive into the Cavs schedule. So the entire NBA schedule, with the exception of a couple games, obviously, for the in-season tournament, was released on Thursday. We've got 80 of the Cavs, 82, possibly 83 games that we're going to see them play this year. A couple of those will be decided by the in-season tournament, as we know. So we won't know about those until December. But I do want to focus on the games that we've got because the full schedule means a ton of takeaways. There are some oddities on this schedule I want to get into later on in the show, but I want to start by just kind of going through a month-by-month breakdown of what this schedule looks like for the Cavs. So let's start at the beginning. Going to group October and November into one. And I do think the Cavs get off to a relatively easy start when you take a look at their first three games. And I think this is an important thing because under a new head coach, which the Cavs obviously have in Kenny Atkinson, I do believe it is important to feel good about yourselves early on. And the Cavs have a great opportunity to do that because they open up in Toronto, who the Raptors aren't going to be awful, I don't think. But I also don't think they're going to be all that great. Like, could I see them being in the play-in as the number 10 seed? Sure, somebody's got to be 10th, but I could also see them finishing with the third worst record in the Eastern Conference. I think that they are sort of in that area. So that's where the Cavs open up. That game is in Toronto. Hopefully it doesn't bring back any bad memories of Darius Garland having his eyelid cut open the way it was by Gary Trent Jr. on opening night a couple of years ago. And then the home opener is a couple of days later as the Detroit Pistons and old friend JB Bickerstaff come to town. I think it's a little spicy that the guy who was just let go as head coach of the Cavs will be returning so early in the season. I think that's a little cool twist. Well, it gives just a little bit more stakes to the home opener. At the end of the day, of course, it's just one of 82. It's just one regular season basketball game, and the Detroit Pistons will, I think, under JB Bickerstaff, be better than they were last year under Monty Williams, but no one's going to confuse them with a playoff team. They're a few years away from that. They've got some talent. I think they've got better coaching now. But either way, that should be another win. And I'm not going to play the schedule game here, but I just think that these first three games are worth touching on. So those are games 1 and 2, and then game 3 is the second night of their first back-to-back of the season. Again, they have Detroit. That is Friday, October 25th for their home opener. October 26th, that's Saturday, their first back-to-back. They play in Washington. The Wizards, I think, should be pretty bad. So that is a good, easy start to the season for a team that does have continuity but is going to be feeling some things out with the new head coach. They've got a relatively easy start. And one of the things I did here is I put together the toughest stretch for every month. You know, I didn't have one for October because there are only 5 games, but basically the toughest stretch for November starts at the end of October. They play at New York, tough game. LeBron and the Lakers come to town October 30th. That'll be a tough game. A playoff rematch on ESPN November 1st as the Orlando Magic come to town. That will be a difficult game. Then Second night of a back-to-back, they go to Milwaukee. That'll be a tough game. Then, 2 days later, Milwaukee comes to Cleveland. That'll be a difficult game. The Pelicans in New Orleans, that's next. And then the Warriors. So that's a really difficult stretch early on in the season. So those first 3 games, I don't want to say they're gimme games, because as we know from following this team over the last several years, any team in the NBA on any night can find a way to win a basketball game. But the Cavs realistically should win at least 2 of those first 3 games. But then the next handful of games where you go New York, the Lakers, the Magic, the Bucks twice, New Orleans, and then the Warriors, that's a difficult stretch. That is going to be a very fun, challenging test for this Cavs team early on in the season that we're going to get to see. So that's really the first time I think that this team is going to be tested, because not only is it, a couple of difficult games there, but you've got 2 back-to-backs in there too, because Orlando and Milwaukee is back-to-back number 2 of the season. And then at the end of that tough stretch, you've got Golden State at home, and then you play Brooklyn at home the next night. That's back-to-back number 3 of the season. There are 16 sets of back-to-backs this season for the Cavs, 16 of them. So that is something to watch out for as well. And I believe in 13 of those 16 back-to-backs, the Cavs have to travel overnight. So in one of these, the Warriors-Brooklyn game, that is one of the 3 that they don't. But for the most part, with their back-to-backs, they're not home back-to-backs. They're either home road or road back-to-backs. And that is, I think, obviously much more difficult. So that, to me, is the toughest stretch in October. And then they do have some relatively easy games. They play Brooklyn, as I mentioned. They play Chicago twice that month. They've got Charlotte in November. They've got Toronto in November. They do have their first matchup with Boston as one of their in-season tournament games. That will certainly be one to watch. That game is on TNT. So that is a game that will be not the Cavs' first national television appearance of the season. That'll be their game against Orlando, Friday, November 1st. That'll be on ESPN. But this is a chance. The Cavs are going to be on national TV a couple times early on in the season with playoff rematches. One against Orlando, one against Boston. Those will be opportunities for the Cavs to make early season statements. And early season statements are what they are. They don't mean a whole ton, but you do want to look good in those instances. So now we move on to December. This month is sort of tough to flesh out because basically, a week of the schedule is empty right now. From December 9th to December 20th or 19th, the Cavs don't have any games scheduled because those dates are blocked out for the in-season tournament. Either they will be playing in the quarterfinals of the NBA Cup, or they will have a couple of regular season games sprinkled in against teams that also did not make it to the knockout round of the NBA Cup. So we don't know what those games yet are, but the tough stretch in this month is really coming right off of the NBA Cup. So it could be even more difficult. Say they're playing in the championship of the NBA Cup out in Vegas. That would make this more challenging. But December 20th, they go Milwaukee at home, Philly the 21st at home. So that's another back-to-back. It's their second of 3 home back-to-backs. This is probably the most difficult of the bunch because you've got 2 conference finals contenders in Milwaukee and Philly on back-to-back nights. That's going to be difficult. Then they've got Utah, and then they begin their first West Coast trip of the year. That first West Coast trip includes a date in Denver, at Golden State, which is the front end of a back-to-back. The second game of that back-to-back will be at Los Angeles. The Cavs are going to be the first team, and I do think this is kind of a cool little quirk with the schedule. It's fitting. LeBron James will turn 40 on December 30th. The first team he will play as a 40-year-old in the NBA is the first team he ever played for in the NBA in the Cavs. So I do think that's just a little cool quirk. And then the Cavs will wrap up their first of 2 West Coast road trips with a date in Dallas on January 3rd. I definitely think that is the toughest stretch of that month, is that West Coast trip, starting with, it starts at home with 2 games against conference powers in Milwaukee and Philly. Sure, that game against Utah shouldn't be all that difficult. That should be a game that the Cavs do win, But then you got to go out west, and things are going to be difficult out there. The Cavs also have a game against Denver and against Boston early on in the month. Boston is the first. Denver in Cleveland is Thursday, December 5th. The Miami Heat will host the Cavs December 8th. They also have really their easy games of the month. They play Washington at home December 3rd, and they play at Charlotte on December 7th. So that is something just to keep in mind as we roll through the months. We're going to move on to January, February, the rest of the season. And of course, got a few quirks that I want to talk about with this schedule. So that is all straight ahead right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the place to go when you are looking for tickets. It's an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. And right now, if you're in Cleveland, I know the Guardians are not at home this weekend, but when the Guardians get back from their current road trip, you're going to want to go check out the Guardians. The best record in baseball, just coming off of a sweep against Chicago's National League team. Really impressive stuff after they had a bad stretch earlier this month. But it's great to see the fact that the Guardians have righted the ship. So you're going to want to get on over to Progressive Field and check them out. And the way you're going to want to do that is by firing up that Game Time app. They've got killer last minute deals, all in prices on the app. So you're not going to be surprised with last minute taxes and fees and all that other junk that you see some places. No, Game Time is going to tell you what you are paying up front, and it makes it for such a better experience. Also, they will show you what your view of the field is going to look like from your seat before you buy. That's a really cool feature that the Game Time app has. I've used Game Time the last time I went to a Guardians game. Where did I buy my tickets? Where do you think I bought my tickets? I went on Game Time, and you should too. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Again, you can get the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening via Apple, Spotify, anywhere else, make sure you click that subscribe button for me. Help me to grow the show. Thank you again for making us your first listener of the day. Now for your second listen, go on and enjoy Locked On NBA. There's no offseason. Obviously, we just got the schedule. More teams than just the Cavs found out what their schedule is going to be. So maybe you want to know what some of the marquee games nationally look like. Well, Locked On NBA has you covered. No one keeps you as informed and as entertained as Locked On NBA. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So moving on to January, I think the tough stretch in this month for the Cavs, I know that Dallas game at the start is tough. They've got another date. It's their third and final home back-to-back. OKC comes to town Wednesday, January 8th, and then they've got Toronto the 9th. OKC will be a very difficult test. Obviously, I'm not high on Toronto going into this year. But the tough test for the Cavs in this month starts after that. So they've got back-to-back games against the Pacers. They're in Cleveland against Indiana on January 12th, and then they go to Indiana Tuesday, January 14th. That game will be on TNT. That's going to be a tough test. Obviously, Indiana is a good basketball team, but that stretch continues with a game in OKC, January 16th. Then they go to Minnesota, January 18th. So two big-time Western Conference opponents on the road back-to-back. And then they come home, Martin Luther King Day. They'll take on the Phoenix Suns at Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. Interesting note about that game is, one, it's just a little one-off home game. Like, the Cavs don't come home for a set of home games. They play Phoenix, and then they go right back on the road. Two, that game is scheduled to be tipped off at 3:30. So one of the things that is, it's a common thought in NBA circles, is that when you come off of, even if it's not a long, like a super long road trip, but I think 3 games probably qualifies considering you're going to be in 2 different time zones and you're coming back from the central time zone at the end of that trip. That first home game back can sometimes sort of feel like an away game. And when you move the time of that game up, so it's not, NBA players are very much creatures of habit. So instead of playing at 7 or 7:30 or 8 like they're so often used to, coming home from a road trip and moving the game up to 3:30 is difficult. This happened a couple years ago. The Cavs took on the Pelicans. It was also on MLK Day. They played, I don't know if the game was at 3:33 or 4, but it was an afternoon tip-off. And the Cavs won partially because the Pelicans were so beat up at that point. I don't believe Brendan Ingram played. I know Zion didn't play. So they sort of caught a break there. But it was one of the games, and the Cavs will go through their schedule. And they will look at games that, okay, we are at a rest advantage here, or we're at a rest disadvantage here. And they'll sort of rank them. And that game against the Pelicans was one where they felt like they were at a pretty significant disadvantage because they were coming back from a road trip. And that was a longer road trip. It was a 5-game trip out west. But they're coming back from a road trip having to play in the afternoon against a really good team. That is a challenge. So I do think that this Phoenix game is definitely a test. That, I think, is the toughest stretch of this month. You look at the rest of the month, they do play Philadelphia in Philadelphia. Yet again, it's part of a back-to-back. This one is a home or a road home back-to-back where they play Philly on the road Friday night and then they come home and play Houston at home the very next night. That'll be a difficult thing, especially because they'll play Houston twice in 4 days. That third game is the second game against Houston, I should say, is the third game in 4 nights for the Cavs. So that will be a challenge. Moving on to February, obviously this month, just a little bit lighter in terms of the schedule load because of the All-Star break. They open up with 2 really difficult games. They open up those games, Dallas and Boston. And then I do think things are a little bit lighter leading into the break where, they're in Detroit, they're in Washington. It feels like anytime they play Detroit this season, they play Washington really closely after, and they play Toronto too around that time because they play Toronto a week after playing Detroit. The Timberwolves will come to town during this month. Obviously, that will be a challenging game. It should be a fun game if it's anything like last year's game between those two teams here in Cleveland. And then the All-Star break arrives. So that'll be obviously a good time off for the team. I'm sure they will be sending at least one, hopefully more than just one All-Star to the All-Star game this year. Then things get difficult. I think the toughest stretch in February is the end of February. And that's not great considering the month of March for the Cavs, also really difficult. We'll get to that in a second. But the toughest stretch for them. They come back from the break with a game in Brooklyn. That's not a big deal. But then that game is night 1 of a back-to-back. It's a back-to-back you would honestly rather be a road back-to-back. Because game 2 of the back-to-back is against the New York Knicks. That game in Cleveland. So they open up with a Brooklyn, New York back-to-back, but game 2 is not in New York, it's in Cleveland. Then Memphis comes to town, which if they look nothing like last year, where they should be healthy again, John Morant should be back on the floor playing basketball, the Grizzlies will be a tough test. They won't be the Grizzlies of last year. Then they go at Orlando, at Boston. So back-to-back playoff rematches again. That's the difficult stretch in this month. Now, it's nice they have 2 days off before that game in Boston, and both of those playoff rematches will be nationally televised game. Most of the Cavs national TV games, at least as far as ESPN and TNT go, I don't necessarily always count NBA TV as nationally televised because so many people don't get it. But most of those games seem to be on the road, which if you're a Cavs fan, considering the situation with Bally Sports here in Cleveland, and just how many people, how people choose to watch their games, that's not the worst thing in the world because you get an opportunity to see more games that you don't have the chance to go to if it were here. So that is something I do think is a bit of a blessing in disguise. And now on to what I think is the most difficult month of the season for the Cavs, and that's March. And March has been brutal for the Cavs for years. Part of it is because this month always has a decent-sized road trip because Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse has been used for the MAC tournament every March, and this month is no different. They've got a big road trip in the middle of the month. That road trip is at Memphis. Then they actually come home for a game. I believe this would be the day after the MAC tournament ends. The MAC championship typically is on the 3rd Saturday in March, which March 15th. So then they play at home against Orlando March 16th. Then they go out west for their second of 2 West Coast trips of the year. This trip at the Clippers at Sacramento. That's a back-to-back, a Tuesday, Wednesday back-to-back. Obviously, you do have to travel there from LA up to Sacramento. At Phoenix the 21st, at Utah the 23rd, and then that trip wraps up in Portland. So the first three of those opponents are obviously more difficult than the final two. I would suspect Utah by that point in the season will not be trying to win games. They'll be trying to win the services of Cooper Flagg via the NBA draft. And then Portland, I don't anticipate to be very good either. So you get a little bit of a break there. But by the end of the road trip, you don't know what's going to be happening. Then, as I mentioned previously, the first game back from a road trip, not always the easiest thing. Kind of that home game that can feel like a road game, right? Well, the San Antonio Spurs and Victor Wembanyama are in town for that game. So that I think is the toughest stretch. And then they close the month with, a game in Detroit, which is the second night of a back-to-back. And then the LA Clippers come to town for a matinee game on March 30th. We've got one more month to talk about. I want to dive into that. Plus, I want to talk about a few scheduling oddities that this schedule has brought forth for the Cavaliers. That's straight ahead right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports. If you're listening to me talk about the Cavs schedule, you love sports. You love the Cavs. You love basketball. You can't wait for the NBA to be back, just like I can't wait for the NBA to be back. But while we wait for that, there's plenty of stuff going on, and FanDuel has you covered. I've been talking about Emmanuel Clase winning the AL Cy Young and how his odds have surged. He was plus 10,000 earlier this week when I was doing this read. As I record this Thursday night, Emmanuel Clase plus 5,500. His odds have been slashed in half. I hope you took him when he was plus 10,000. But if not, there's still time to jump aboard because Emmanuel Clase, as I've been saying, is the best pitcher in baseball. No one is more dominant. No one is better. Who cares if he's the closer and doesn't pitch every fifth day? Guess what? This week he pitched almost every day. Pitched 4 days, 4 saves, 4 days in a row. If that doesn't say Cy Young, I don't know what does. I mean, this guy, he's being compared to Mariano Rivera. The first 4 years of Emmanuel Clase's career are better than the first 4 years of Mariano Rivera's career. That guy deserves a Cy Young. I think so. FanDuel's starting to come around. They're starting to think so. If you think so, FanDuel is the place to take that wager because FanDuel, of course, is the official marketplace of Major League Baseball. It is a gambling partner with Major League Baseball. It is the place that you want to go. And they've got something for everybody every day, all summer long. They're hooking you up. They've got a boost. They've got a bonus. They've got what you need to get you through the summer. FanDuel is the place to go. It's absolutely how you can make the most out of your summer. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. It's great that we've got a schedule. We are counting down the days until basketball training camp will be here. We're like a month and a half away from media day across the NBA. So basketball is coming back. It's closer than you think. Going to start getting into some player previews on the show. Probably not next week, but probably the week after that. We will be talking plenty of Darius Garland. I've got some guests lined up that I cannot wait to talk to about this upcoming Cavs season. But the Cavs do finish up in April, and the tough stretch this month is the last 3 games, where they've got their final back-to-back of the season, their 16th and final back-to-back. It is a road back-to-back. Game 1 is April 10th at Indiana. Okay. Game 2, April 11th at New York Knicks. That is a tough back-to-back, especially considering the Cavs at that point will probably be playing for seeding. Heck, they might need to win one or both of those games to secure home court advantage in the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs. So that is something to think about. And then their final regular season game. The Cavs have been lucky enough, and I know they lost it last year, that's a different discussion, but they've had Charlotte, the final regular season game, for the last couple of years, and that's been nice. This year it's Indiana. This year it's a team that should be fighting for playoff position alongside them. So this year, if they want to rest their guys, maybe they'll be in the position to. But if this is a game that they need to win, it might not be a walk in the park. So I think that's the toughest schedule. That's the toughest part of the schedule in February. Now, for the things that I think are odd about this schedule, if you pull up the printable version, which is what I've been looking at, it's easier to see how weird this looks. The Cavs play, with the exception of February 14th, which is part of the All-Star break. The Cavs play every Friday night from February 7th through the end of the season. Every Friday they have a game. Only one of them is at home. The Cavs are on the road almost every single weekend from the start of February until the end of the season. They have one home Friday or Saturday night game. That's it. That's really tough. That's a tough break. That is something that for Cavs fans I feel for, because you want to go to these games, you want to check out the Cavs, and it's so much easier to do it when you don't have to worry about waking up for work the next day for the most part. So Friday and Saturday night games are awesome to go to. Well, you've got one opportunity to do that in the second half of the season. That's tough. That's a game. It's a great game. The New York Knicks are in town. It is the second night of a back-to-back. But the fact that there's only one home Friday or Saturday night game, that's sort of a bummer. They do have several Sunday games. It feels like they play. I mean, they do play from after the All-Star break. They play every Sunday through the end of the season. They play every Friday. They play every Sunday. They have no Saturday games the second half of the season. Every Friday, every Sunday, the Cavs are in action after the All-Star break. So that's a bit of a scheduling oddity. I'm interested the fact that they play Detroit. It seems like every time they play the Pistons this year, it's a back-to-back. Their first game against Detroit at home, night one of a back-to-back. Their second game against Detroit is not a back-to-back, but then the two games that they go to Detroit are both the second night of back-to-backs for the Cavs. So that is another little bit of a scheduling quirk, a little bit of a scheduling oddity, if you will, as we look at this. But it is something that, I think March is tough. I think the first week of this schedule is easy. I think the Cavs should get off to a pretty good start. But then after that, man, that next stretch of games is one of the more difficult ones on the schedule. And then one of the other oddities that I noticed is the Cavs have to go to Texas 3 times. Now, you're going to say, of course they have to go to Texas 3 times. They play San Antonio once, they play in Dallas once, and they play in Houston once. You're right. Those 3 games are in 3 different trips. There's not a trip where they just go, hey, we're going to knock out all 3 Texas teams. No, they go to Dallas the start of January as part of a West Coast trip. They go to Houston. They go to Houston in January as well, which is a 2-game road trip in Houston and in Philadelphia. And then they go to San Antonio on a 1-game road trip in April. Like, that's a really weird quirk, the fact that they have to take 3 separate trips to Texas. I would love to know, and drop in the comments, what's your favorite thing about the schedule this year for the Cavs? And also, let me know what your least favorite thing about the schedule is for the Cavs this year, because I'm very curious to hear. I know a lot of people are upset with the number of Friday road games late in the season, just because obviously you have a ton of opportunities to go to Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse and check out this team, but in the second half of the season, almost all their weekend games are on the road. So that is a bit of a bummer. But let me know in the YouTube comments, or if you're listening to this, tweet at me your thoughts, what you think about this schedule. You can find me at RealDCunningham on Twitter, of course. And once again, thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find the show wherever you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Make sure you're subscribed. If you're watching on YouTube right now, click that like button right below me. Make sure you hit that subscribe button as well. And click the notification bell. We will be back next week with a fresh week of Locked On Cavs.